For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I've still been thinking on those verses, and I've still been thinking about how God's ways and thoughts are different and higher than man's ways and thoughts. I've been thinking about those verses for several months now, particularly, and I'm still thinking about them. And with that as a preface, I'll get on with the message for this video. Live your life for God and nobody else, and it will not be wasted, and it will be successful, the best it can truly be. There is no better way to live it. Devoted to God, submitted to Him. The world would disagree, and so would the flesh and the devil, but it is true. Giving up your life to keep it. What seems like a contradiction is true, and it is often that way when it comes to God's ways versus the world's ways. They are always at odds and will never agree. But the contradictions, they are true. This the mind cannot overcome by itself, but the Spirit of God can overcome it, and not only overcome it, but make sense of it. This is why man alone cannot understand it. It is understood by God's Spirit in him. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who among men knows the thoughts of man, except his own spirit within him? So too, no one knows the thoughts of God, except the Spirit of God. We have not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. And this is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths in spiritual words. The natural man does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them, because they are spiritually discerned. This message is about how God's ways and many spiritual truths seem like contradictions. They seem like contradictions to man, unless by God's enablement he is able to spiritually discern the truth of them. And so I want to examine some examples of God's ways and spiritual truths that seem like contradictions. Contradictions they may seem, but they are true. First of all, what is the definition of contradiction? So I looked it up in the dictionary, and what came up is the word contradict, which is a verb. Contradiction is the noun variation of that. But so the definition of contradict is to assert or express the opposite of. Instead of titling this message, "The Contradiction is True," I almost titled it, "The Paradox is True." The word paradox could work very well instead of contradiction. The definition of paradox is a statement that seems to conflict with common sense or to contradict itself, but that may nevertheless be true. With the terms contradiction and paradox now defined, let's take a look at some examples of such things in the Bible. Contradictions and paradoxes that are nevertheless true. And contradictions and paradoxes that display God's ways, as well as the spiritual perspective, the spiritual reality of things. All right, so the first one. Our hearts ache, but we always have joy. We are poor, but we give spiritual riches to others. We own nothing, and yet we have everything. Now, looking at that purely through my own logic, that doesn't make sense at all to me. That doesn't make sense at all to me. Those are a lot of contradictions. A lot of paradoxes right there. Our hearts ache, but we have joy. We are poor, but we give spiritual riches to others. We own nothing, and yet we have everything. I would think that the viewpoint of the flesh and the world and the devil, there wouldn't be all the but in there. Do you know what I mean? But we always have joy, but we give spiritual riches to others, and yet we have everything. Looking at it only through a fleshly perspective, my own logic, and trying to look at it through the viewpoint of the world and the devil. Well, actually, I might amend what I just said about the devil, but if I look at it that way, in those perspectives, there wouldn't be those secondary parts there. It would just be our hearts ache, we are poor, and we own nothing. That's about what it would be. But if I look at it through a spiritual lens, it doesn't just end there. It doesn't just end at our heart's sake, we are poor and we own nothing. Looking at that with a spiritual perspective is our heart's sake, but we always have joy. Now, how can you always have joy if your hearts are aching? Why? Because you're not just living in the flesh anymore. There's that reborn part of you if you are a Christian. We are poor, but we give spiritual riches to others. Again, what do you mean? Like, if you're poor, what do you have to give? Well, you can be poor, but apparently you can give spiritual riches to others, not necessarily material riches. We own nothing, and yet we have everything. Again, in the viewpoint of the world and the flesh, if you own nothing, you own nothing. And it ends there. But looking at that with a spiritual perspective, it doesn't end there. It says we own nothing, and yet we have everything. What's the everything? Things that are beyond just material things, for one. Things that are beyond the boundaries of this world. I hope you understand what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so a minute ago I said I might amend what I said about the devil sharing these perspectives. Not to sing praises about our enemy or anything, but I think he is knowledgeable enough to know that Christians may be poor or may own nothing or their hearts may ache, but I think he knows enough to know about this. I think he knows enough about the spiritual realm to know that that is not the whole picture. But he will want you to think as a Christian that it ends there. He doesn't want you to see the full spiritual truth, the full spiritual perspective of what is really going on. So he'll lie to you and say that that's where it ends, there's nothing more. But he knows better. Okay, moving on. The next example. Then Jesus said to his disciples, remember, we are looking at examples of contradictions, what seem like contradictions and paradoxes in the Bible. Okay, so the next example is, then Jesus said to his disciples, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. Again, do you see the paradox? Do you see the contradiction? If you give up your life for his sake, you will save it. The paradox is, the contradiction is, what do you mean giving up something will allow me to save it? That's the contradiction there. And yes, again, I'm trying to illustrate also as we look at these examples, I'm trying to illustrate also how God sees things versus how man would see things. And the difference there. Remember the verses from Isaiah that I opened with about how God's ways and thoughts are higher and different than man's ways and thoughts? Yes. So as I read these contradictions and paradoxes, what I was trying to illustrate also is God's way versus man's way, and God's perspective versus man's perspective. So keep that in mind as we look at these examples. So yes, if you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. I'm not sure exactly how to elaborate on that, except that if you choose to live this life solely for yourself and do not believe in Jesus as your Lord and therefore follow and obey him, it's one thing to think Jesus is your Lord. It's another thing for it to show that to be true in your life if you love and obey him. Do you know what I'm trying to say? If you can call him Lord all day long, but is it really so in your life, or you just call him that? Anyways, if you don't believe in him and follow him as Lord, you will end up losing your life. You'll have it for a while you're here on earth, but not after. Not after this earthly life is over. Moving on. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Okay, so that's related to the previous example. There is something about, okay, it's illustrated with a grain of wheat falling into the earth and dies. If it dies, it bears much fruit. That is illustrating our lives as Christians. Yet, what does it have to do? It has to submit, it has to die, basically. That life may come from that. And again, whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. And when it says hates his life, I don't believe that that means that you hate it like, not exactly hate it. I think what it's getting at is you hate it in terms of that you won't want to keep it for yourself. You'll want to give it up to the Lord. And again, the paradox, giving it up to keep it. Keep it for eternal life. All right. Then they came to Capernaum. While Jesus was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the last of all and the servant of all." All right. Do you notice the contradiction there, the paradox there? It is that if anyone wants to be first, he must be the last of all and the servant of all. That is God's way. Do you see how it's different from man's way? To me, man's way is, if anyone wants to be first, then he should do all he can to be first, not be last. Strive and work really hard to be first. And it says, he must be the last of all and the servant of all. If you want to be the first, You must be the last and the servant of all. Again, if I look at that just with my own mind and my own logic, to be first, I wouldn't be the servant. To be first, I'd be the one fighting to be served. I would be the one striving to be first. I would be the one striving to be on top. I think that is the viewpoint of man. What do you mean, what do you mean be last to be first? That's the paradox, the contradiction, but nevertheless that is God's way. And God's way is the true way if you want to live this life for Him. And I think that especially flies in the face of pride. That truth, this particular truth, particularly flies in the face of pride, because if you want to be first, pride is most willing to work with you to get yourself into first place, whereas if you are going to be last of all and servant of all, pride is not going to help you do that. It's humility that would be required at that point. Moving on, the greatest among you shall be your servant. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Again, that's sort of related to what I just said about pride and humility, and it is related to the previous example. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. That's the contradiction, that's the paradox, and I hope it helps to illustrate the difference between God's ways and thoughts versus man's ways and thoughts, because, and in general, when I say man's ways and thoughts, I'm including the world at large. The world's ways and thoughts. And the devil too. I can include the devil's ways and thoughts on that one. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Okay, that's the paradox, that's the contradiction. That's what doesn't seem to make common sense, right, in man's way of thinking. If I want to be exalted, I would do what I could to do that. I wouldn't do what seems like the opposite and humble myself. Why would I humble myself if I wanted to be exalted? Do you see the difference between man's way and God's way? Moving on, this is quite related to what example I just shared, but humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, so that in due time He may exalt you. Also, humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will exalt you. I'm not sure if I need to say more on that one, other than to continue to drill this point of notice the paradox, notice the contradiction, and yet that's God's way. All right, moving on. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said, Truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Now, again, in man's way of seeing things, in the world's way of seeing things, it is very clear that the rich people who put in large sums in the offering box, apparently, it is very clear that they gave more. The rich people put in large sums, and the poor widow put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. Now, obviously, again, in the viewpoint of man in the world, the 2 coins that made a penny are smaller than the large sums. The large sums are more. That's the way man and the world generally see things. The more money is the more money, not the 2 coins. However, Jesus is saying that she contributed more than the others. What do you mean she contributed more? It's because the others contributed out of their abundance, but out of her poverty, she gave everything she had, all she had to live on. That's why it was more. God is looking at what it costs a person. What sacrifice was given that actually was a sacrifice and not just almost nothing because you have so much anyway. That is not only very different, I think, than how the world and man can view such a thing, but it also is a bit of a challenge, actually, to me, that God is seeing what was a costlier sacrifice to you personally. That's challenging. That's a challenge to me. It can seem like you're doing a lot, offering a lot, sacrificing a lot, but are you really? Did it come easier to you in actuality because it wasn't that much of a sacrifice because you had much to give anyway? Or were you doing things out of some form of poverty where it hurt? It hurt to give that. Do you see the difference? All right, moving on. At that time, Jesus declared, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this was well-pleasing in your sight. And I have thanked God for the same thing, basically. What I see there is that God chooses to show and reveal things to lowly people. God chooses others, not the people the world would choose, to show and reveal things to. And that seems deep to me. That seems very deep to me. I think the next example will clarify this further, so I'll just move on to the next example. Remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes, or powerful, or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God chose things the world considers foolish, in order to shame those who think they are wise. And He chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose these things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. I think that brings some clarity to the previous example, and I think it is an excellent example of the contradiction and the paradox, and the fact that God's ways and thoughts are different and higher than man's ways and thoughts. You can see what the world chooses. The world will choose the powerful, the wealthy, those who are considered wise. That's what the world will choose. But God doesn't. God doesn't. And why? God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. Well, thank God for that. I'm glad no one will be able to boast in the presence of God. Furthermore, I think the fact that God uses apparently God uses things counted as nothing at all. I think that also allows God to show how amazing He is, that He can use what is counted as nothing and do the most marvelous things through them. And it shows His power. It shows His ability, His glory. I like that God's ways are different than man's ways. So, those are some examples of contradictions and paradoxes in the Bible that are true. There are probably more than what I've mentioned here. Maybe you can think of some other examples. God's ways are different and higher than man's ways. I think these examples of contradictions and paradoxes help to illustrate how God's ways are different and how the spiritual perspective of reality is so very different than natural or unregenerate man's perspective of things. In addition, I think it's good to learn how God's ways are different and higher, that we might know our God better. And as He continues the transformative work in our lives and as we conform ourselves to Him, we can resemble Him more and more. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. When you learn to know how God is and what He values, you'll see how very different He is from man. Even so, these things are not learned with one's own understanding alone. The natural man does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually discerned. I've been more aware lately of how grateful I am that God is not like man. I'm thankful and grateful that His ways are higher. I'm grateful that, at least to some extent, that I realize that He is not like man. I'm thankful for this awareness, though I am still learning about the differences. But really, if you think about how man is, I'm so grateful that God is not like that. Really, if you take a moment and think about how man is, I am grateful that God is not like that. I hope you know what I'm getting at. I'm thankful that our God does not judge by appearances, that He chooses the lowly things, that He isn't all about who has the most money or who is the most eloquent. I'm glad that He is different than man. And with that, I'm just about finished. There is only one last Bible verse that I want to share, which I found quite interesting, because it relates to God being different from man. I'll read only part of the verse. You can look it up in the Bible if you want to, for the full verse and the full context. It is part of Psalm chapter 50, verse 21, and it is as if the Lord is speaking, as if God is speaking. You have done these things, and I kept silent. You thought I was just like you.